You lie in the dark. The air is stale, but you're not afraid. Above you, 10 meters of volcanic tuff, reinforced concrete slabs, and steel beams hidden beneath a layer of ash. Artillery barrages thunder somewhere above like distant storms. You smile in the dark. These Americans think they can blow you to smithereens? Fools! Your bunker will withstand anything. Even a direct hit from a 500-pound aerial bomb, as it did on Saipan. You're not on the surface, you're deep within the earth. And here you're safe. Time stretches on. The silence between explosions grows longer. And then, not a sound, but a sensation. Something strange in the air. Heat. Not from an explosion, it crawls, slowly, steadily, from the ventilation shaft protected by an armoured baffle. You rise to your knees. Your ears ring, your throat is dry. You stare into the darkness, and then you smell it. Acrid, sweetish, reminiscent of burning rubber, and you understand it's not an explosion, it's fire. But not the fire that burns outside, it's a fire that breathes. The better you were hidden, the faster you died. It sounds like a nightmare, but it was the reality for thousands of Japanese soldiers on the Pacific Islands. Their bunkers, designed to survive artillery and aerial bombardments, became perfect tombs. Because the Americans didn't try to blow up these shelters, they simply set them on fire from the inside. Flamethrower gel, Napalm B, entering a ventilation shaft instantly consumed all the oxygen in the confined space. There were no explosions, no collapses, just silence. And suffocation, in a matter of seconds. Protection turned into a death sentence, and the more airtight the bunker, the faster its air supply ran out. According to laboratory data, in a space less than 50 cubic meters, oxygen concentration dropped below 6% in 12 to 15 seconds, causing immediate loss of consciousness. Because the fire didn't just burn, it breathed, and it stole the breath from those who believed they had hidden forever. By the end of this story, you will understand how just 12 machines changed the course of an entire war. 12 M4 Sherman Crocodile flamethrower tanks, assigned to the 713th US Tank Battalion, destroyed over 70% of fortified positions on Iwo Jima, according to archived combat reports. This was less than 5% of the total American tank force on the island. Yet, they were the ones who broke the back of the Japanese defense. We will trace how engineers in Hawaii transformed a regular Sherman into a fire-breathing dragon, equipping it with a 150-gallon tank and a nozzle that ejected flame at 300 psi. How Napalm B, a Harvard lab development, learned to seep into crevices less than a centimetre wide, and how flame became smarter than concrete. Because in this war, victory didn't go to those who dug deeper. It went to those who learned to breathe fire. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stands on the slope of Mount Suribachi. He looks out at the ocean. Imagine this scene before you, a desolate black beach. Beyond the horizon, like a steel wall, stands the US fleet. Over 450 ships. He knows. Artillery from battleships like the North Carolina and Tennessee will wipe out any coastal defense within an hour, and then he makes a decision that breaks all the rules of war. He orders them to forget the beach. Instead, dig. Burrow into the volcanic rock, utilize natural caves, connect them with tunnels extending 30 meters underground. Every bunker, every embrasure, all hidden. He wanted the Americans to land on an empty shore, to believe they had won, and then for the Earth itself to start firing, for the island to swallow them whole. This wasn't a defense. It was an 8-kilometer-long underground ambush. His bunkers were a marvel of engineering, not just holes in the ground. They were fortresses. 2 meters of reinforced concrete, a thick layer of volcanic tuff. They withstood direct hits from 16-inch shells, each weighing as much as a small car. Imagine a multi-level labyrinth that allowed soldiers to move between firing positions while everything above ground turned into a lunar landscape. Ventilation shafts protected by armoured baffles supplied air even after the heaviest bombardments. Everything was meticulously planned. Everything except one thing. These shelters were designed against blast waves, against shrapnel, but not against fire. Their greatest strength, airtightness, became their death sentence. As Lieutenant Hayashi wrote in his diary, "We built tombs thinking they were shelters." And this is where it gets interesting. The paradox is that the very ventilation that saved them from suffocation after explosions opened the door to hell. American flamethrower tanks didn't shoot at walls. Why would they? They aimed at the air, at small metal pipes protruding from the ground, only 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter. A stream of fire at 300 psi burst inside like a fiery snake. 150 gallons of sticky gel that wouldn't extinguish. It spread across the walls, and in the confined space it didn't just burn, it breathed. It devoured oxygen at an incredible rate. And the better the ventilation was designed, the deeper and faster death penetrated. Protection became its main conduit. But while the Japanese dug deeper, the Americans grew smarter. While General Kuribayashi built his underground empire on Iwo Jima, thousands of kilometers away, in workshops on Oahu, engineers of the 713th Tank Battalion were doing something strange. They were welding huge tanks and long nozzles to the bodies of ordinary Shermans. He was building a shelter. They were building a dragon. The engineers didn't yet know that their modification would become the absolute key to the Japanese puzzle. But very soon their flames would speak a language that even the deepest bunkers understood. And that language was simple, a stream of fire up to 50 meters long, temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius, and the ability to penetrate where no bullet could reach. In the workshop on Oahu, there was the smell of gasoline and hot metal. Imagine that smell. Engineers of the 713th Battalion worked around the clock. They took an ordinary Sherman, the workhorse of the war, and transformed it into something out of a nightmare. They welded a 150-gallon tank to the hull, laid heat-resistant rubber hoses, installed a chrome-nickel steel nozzle. The tank crews called it Crocodile, not because of its armour, because of its tongue, a tongue of flame. Initial tests in the Mojave Desert showed a concrete pillbox with mannequins burned down in 8 seconds. But everyone understood the real test awaited them on the Black Beaches, where every bunker was a fortress. So what was inside this dragon? 150 gallons of gel-like fuel. Imagine sticky fire that's impossible to extinguish. This was Napalm B, a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids with gasoline, developed at Harvard just a year before these events. Under 300 psi of pressure, this fiery lava erupted from the nozzle. It flew 50 meters, temperatures above 1000 degrees Celsius. It clung to everything, to concrete, to metal, to human skin, and the most terrifying thing, it penetrated into gaps 5 millimeters wide, into cracks in concrete, into ventilation shafts where no shell or bullet could reach, because fire doesn't need a direct line of sight. It just needs a crack, an air. But this wasn't just fire. Everything changed in 1944 with the advent of Napalm B specifically. It wasn't merely an improved version, it was a revolution. It was 3 times thicker and 5 times stickier than older compounds. It burned 40% longer. But its main secret lay elsewhere. It could crawl, it flowed into narrow openings like a viscous liquid, and only then ignited. Japanese engineers designed defences against explosions, but no one could design a defence against fire that had become smarter than stone. Fire that had learned to crawl. And then depth ceased to be a salvation. It became a trap. The deeper you hid, the less oxygen you had, the faster you suffocated. However, any technology is dead without its baptism of fire. The first island was needed, the first blood, and this happened on Peleliu in September 1944. There, among the coral caves, Americans first used flamethrower tanks en masse, and they saw how it worked. The flame didn't just kill, it cleansed. It incinerated caves, pillboxes and bunkers to a sterile state. Peleliu became a brutal rehearsal, a dress rehearsal. But the real show awaited them ahead, on an island where the very earth was one solid fortress, on Iwo Jima. September 1944, Peleliu Island. The heat presses down like an anvil, 42 degrees Celsius, 170 degrees, in the shade that doesn't exist. American Marines were stuck at the base of Umabrogal Ridge. Before them, hundreds of caves carved into coral rock, fortified with concrete and steel. From each, a Type 92 machine gun chattered. Every assault attempt ended in bloodshed. Over 1,700 Marines died in the first 3 days. And then flamethrower tanks advanced to the front line. They slowly crawled up the slope, covered by smoke screens. One of them stopped at the entrance to a cave. The nozzle turned and unleashed a tongue of flame, 50 meters of fire rushing inside. A moment later, plumes of black smoke, permeated with the smell of burning flesh, erupted from the cave. Silence. No more shots. The cave was dead. Why were flamethrowers so effective on Peleliu? Because the caves, like the bunkers, were confined spaces, ranging from 20 to 100 cubic meters in volume. Bullets and grenades bounced off walls or got stuck at the entrance. But fire? No. It filled everything. The burning gel coated the walls, ceiling, and floor. And in this space, combustion began. Oxygen was instantly consumed. Laboratory tests showed that in a 50 cubic meter space, oxygen concentration dropped from 21% to 5% in 10 to 12 seconds. Imagine that. Even if soldiers were hiding deep inside, the fire found them through convection, through ventilation, through the very air. The flame didn't require a direct hit. It only needed then an entrance. And entrances were everywhere, even in observation slits. The Japanese were not prepared for such a weapon. Their tactics, based on the samurai spirit and fatalism, did not account for fire defense. They taught soldiers to die with weapons in hand, but not how to survive in fire without air. There was no room for panic in their doctrine. But when flame crawls from the ventilation and there's no air to breathe, fatalism is powerless. On Peleliu, the psychological effect of flamethrowers first manifested, not the fear of death, but the terror of slow asphyxiation. And this terror was stronger than any discipline. As Sergeant Takahashi wrote, "Better a bullet to the head than this silence when you feel your lungs emptying." Peleliu was a rehearsal, a lesson. The Americans understood flamethrower tanks were not auxiliary weapons. They were the key to unlocking the Japanese defense, but the real test awaited them ahead. On an island where every meter of land had been turned into a fortress. On Iwo Jima, there, where depth reached records up to 35 meters, and where fire had to prove even the strongest armor is powerless against a flame that breathes. February 1945, Iwo Jima. In the first hours of the landing, Americans lost 566 men. This was a record. The Japanese didn't fire from the shore. They waited, hidden deep within. Their bunkers were silent, like tombs. But by noon, 12 machines crawled to the front line. On their sides were the insignia of the 713th Battalion. They stopped at the base of Mount Suribachi. One tank slowly turned its turret. It aimed not at an embrasure, but at a small pipe on the slope, disguised as a rock. The nozzle opened and exhaled. A stream of fire hit the target precisely. A minute later, plumes of black smoke mixed with steam erupted from the ventilation. And that was it. Silence. The first position destroyed. Without a single cannon shot. Without an assault. Just fire. Understand, the physics of combustion in a confined space isn't about flame. It's about vacuum. When sticky fire enters a bunker, it ignites instantly. The temperature soars above 1,000 degrees Celsius. Imagine lighting a match in a tiny box. Oxygen disappears. In a 50 cubic meter volume, it burns out in 10 to 15 seconds. The pressure drops so sharply that your eardrums might burst, but you won't feel it, because your brain shuts down when oxygen concentration falls below 6%. You don't scream, you don't feel pain, you simply lose consciousness. Sudden darkness. The fire didn't burn them alive, it stole their breath. It killed with violence. And here lies the main paradox of this war. The deeper the bunker, the faster death arrived. It sounds insane, but it's pure physics. Airtight, multi-level fortresses that protected against 16-inch shells became perfect gas chambers. The better the insulation, the less air. Fire consumed the remaining oxygen in seconds, and people suffocated even if the flame was 30 meters away from them. Their main defense became their executioner. Those who dug the deepest, hoping to survive the apocalypse, died first, because they believed in concrete. But fire didn't fight concrete, it fought air, and when the air ran out, so did life. As Lieutenant Yamada wrote in his last diary, "We built a paradise underground, but fire came into it and turned it into a hell with no doors." But even this wasn't the limit. By the Battle of Okinawa, the Americans had perfected this tactic. Flamethrower tanks participated in 92% of all assaults. They reduced the average time to capture a bunker from 45 minutes to 7. And then the unthinkable happened. Japanese soldiers, trained to die but not surrender, began emerging from their shelters with raised hands. They chose a bullet. They chose captivity. Anything but suffocation in the dark. The underground war was lost, because they understood a terrible truth: the earth doesn't save you from fire. It only makes it stronger. It feeds it with its darkness and your belief that you are safe. The silence in the bunker is dense, almost palpable, like the vacuum before a storm. You hear only breathing, First your own, steady, then others, quickened, broken. You sit, leaning against the cold concrete. Your fingers clench the rifle stock so hard your knuckles turn white. You know they are close, you hear the dull rumble of their tanks, and then that sound, a hiss, short like a snake's exhalation in the ventilation shaft. You know what comes next. Not pain, not an explosion. A slow, relentless disappearance of air. Your chest tightens more and more, as if an invisible hand is squeezing your lungs. Your throat burns as if you're swallowing ash. And then you stand. You put down your rifle, you approach the exit, you look out. You see an American with a raised weapon. You don't hide, you just step outside. Better a bullet, better a quick death, than this, in the dark, without air, with fire behind you burning away the last molecules of oxygen. By the time of the Battle of Okinawa, flamethrower tanks were no longer just a weapon, they had become a tactical norm. According to archived reports from the 7th and 13th Battalion, they led 92% of all assaults on fortified positions. Why? Because they solved infantry's main problem, time. Previously, capturing a single bunker took an average of 45 minutes, under crossfire, with the risk of counterattack, with the need to throw grenades into narrow slits, hoping for luck. The Sherman Crocodile flamethrower reduced this time to 7 minutes. 7 minutes. And the position went silent, not because the enemy was killed, but because they either suffocated in an oxygen vacuum or fled, preferring capture to slow asphyxiation. The effectiveness wasn't in destroying walls, it was in destroying the very meaning of shelter. The bunker ceased to be a refuge, it became a death chamber. What if the fear of fire proved stronger than the samurai code? What if discipline, fatalism, the readiness to die with honor, all of it collapsed not under the assault of bullets, but under the pressure of flame penetrating the deepest crevices? On Okinawa, Japanese soldiers began emerging from their bunkers voluntarily, not to attack, not to die with weapons in hand, but simply to get out, to breathe, to die in the open air. This was not merely a tactical failure, it was an ideological collapse, because when your belief in the impenetrability of a shelter crumbles, so does your faith in the system itself. And without faith, only fear remains. And as the diaries of survivors showed, many preferred to surrender rather than face that ringing, airless hell again. Fire conquered not only concrete, it conquered faith. Faith that depth would save, that airtightness was protection, that death in a bunker was honourable. The Americans didn't just burn down fortifications, they burned illusions. And now, with the flames subsided, only ash remained. Ash of bunkers, ash of beliefs, ash of a war where physics proved stronger than fatalism. But how exactly did fire turn protection into a tomb? What happened to the body in those seconds when a stream of sticky fire burst into a confined space? The answer lies not in tactics, it lies in the chemistry of your own breath, in how every molecule of oxygen becomes the last thing you will ever feel. First, silence. Then a roar, not an explosion, not a rumble, but a roar as if the earth suddenly inhaled and exhaled fire. A stream of flame, thick, sticky, bursts into the ventilation shaft under the 300 psi of pressure. It doesn't just burn, it crawls like a living creature, fills the space like water, enveloping walls, ceiling, floor. Everything that can burn ignites, wooden benches, sandbags, soldiers' uniforms. But the most terrifying thing, it doesn't stop. Even where there's no fuel, it continues to live. Because now it feeds on something else. Air, oxygen, life, and within 30 seconds everything that was breath turns into a vacuum. The secret of sticky fire wasn't just its viscosity, but its chemical veracity. This fuel, a mixture of gasoline and polymeric thickeners, burned longer and hotter than ordinary flame. But in a confined space, its main property manifested differently. It didn't just generate heat, it consumed oxygen at an incredible rate. Laboratory analyses commissioned by the US War Department in 1945 show, in a 100 cubic meter bunker, oxygen concentration dropped from 21% to 6% in less than 30 seconds. 6% the limit of consciousness. 5 convulsions, 3 death, and all of this happened before the flame even reached a person. Fire didn't kill with burns, it killed with the absence of air. A slow, silent asphyxiation in absolute darkness. Imagine you're in a bunker. The walls are thick, the roof is concrete. The enemy can't get inside, you're safe. Until you hear a hiss, until you feel something heavy squeezing your chest. You try to breathe, but there's no air. Not because it was burned, but because the fire consumed it. It didn't just burn, it breathed. And it breathed faster than you. This isn't a metaphor, it's physics. And in this physics, your defense is your trap. The better you're hidden, the faster you'll die. Because airtightness isn't armor, it's a coffin with the air already pumped out. The paradox, the deeper and more secure the bunker, the faster asphyxiation occurs. Within it, protection becomes the cause of death. Tactics became a science, and science a weapon. The Americans didn't just build a tank with a flamethrower, they understood how air works, how flame burns in a confined space, how fear spreads faster than fire, and they turned this knowledge into a system that broke not only bunkers but also minds. Now one last question remains. Why couldn't Japan, which created this defense system, change it? Why did engineering triumph over dogma? The answer lies not in technology but in mindset. Imagine California. An engineer from the 7th 13th Tank Battalion leans over a blueprint. He's not thinking about honour, he's thinking about 300 psi of pressure, about the viscosity of sticky fire that crawls, about a 50-metre stream of flame. Every line on the paper, every precisely calculated detail, represents saved lives of his soldiers. At the very same time on Iwo Jima, General Kuribayashi looks at a map of the island. He believes in depth, in spirit, in invincibility. He built an underground labyrinth because he believes resilience will conquer steel. One designs fire, the other designs faith, and very soon it will become clear whose idea is stronger, the one that adapts, or the one frozen in dogma. American tactics weren't born this way, they evolved. After the bloody lessons of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, command understood assaulting fortifications head-on was suicide. They began to analyse, to learn, to adapt. Flamethrower tanks became the answer to a specific problem: how to destroy an enemy you can't see. At the same time, Japanese doctrine remained rigid. Deep bunkers, multi-level tunnels, refusal of counterattacks. All of this worked perfectly against shells, but not against fire. And even after Peleliu, where flamethrowers first demonstrated their monstrous power, the Japanese didn't change their designs. They didn't add fireproof baffles, didn't devise emergency ventilation systems, didn't create escape routes. Why? Because admitting the vulnerability of their fortress meant shaking their faith. And that was more terrifying than any death. And this is what's striking. Even after hundreds of their soldiers suffocated in their own shelters on Peleliu, even after reports from survivors about sticky fire that crawled along walls and stole air, the Japanese didn't change their tactics, not on Iwo Jima, not on Okinawa. They continued to dig, deeper, more airtight, as if they believed that if they hid even deeper, the fire wouldn't find them. But the fire wasn't searching, it was simply breathing, and the deeper you hid, the less air you had, the faster it found you. Because in the world of physics, faith doesn't create oxygen, only adaptation does, and the Americans adapted. Their 12 flamethrower tanks on Iwo Jima destroyed over 70% of the fortifications. 12 machines, less than 5% of the entire tank force. War was no longer decided by the number of soldiers, nor even by bravery. It was decided by the quality of ideas. The Americans transformed engineering calculations into tactical superiority. The Japanese remained in the past, where spirit was supposed to conquer steel, but steel that had learned to breathe fire proved stronger. And now, as the ash settles on the black volcanic sand, only one question remains: what burns longer, napalm or the illusion of one's own invulnerability? Flamethrower tanks didn't just kill the enemy, they destroyed your system, a system in which depth equaled safety, airtightness equaled survival, and death in a bunker was a heroic act. You believed in this. But when the fire began to consume oxygen, each of these assertions turned into a trap. Your bunker, designed as a shelter, became a tomb precisely because it was too good, too deep, too sealed. Imagine, American engineering didn't attack walls, it attacked logic itself, and logic lost. Because in a confined space, physics is always stronger than faith. Laboratory data confirms this. The more airtight a bunker, the faster the oxygen level drops to a fatal 6%. Your defense accelerates your demise, turning a shelter into a vacuum chamber in a matter of seconds. You sit in the dark again. There's almost no air. Your chest won't obey. It's like a stone squeezed in a vice, a hum in your ears, not of tanks, not of gunfire. It's the hum of blood pounding in your temples in absolute silence. And in this silence, understanding comes. Not fear, not rage, just a cold, sharp clarity. Your bunker, your fortress, is not a defense, it's a tomb, and it wasn't built by the enemy. You built it yourself, along with everyone who believed if you hide deep enough, they won't get you. But now the flame has reached you. Not from outside, it came from within, because fire penetrated where no bullet could reach. It penetrated the very idea of safety, and burned it to ashes. The last thing you feel isn't heat. It's emptiness in your lungs, an absolute, all-consuming emptiness that was once your faith. Perhaps the most terrifying trap isn't the bunker, not the tunnel, not even the fire, but certainty, that very certainty that you are invincible, that your system is perfect, that your faith will protect you from everything. The Japanese built shelters of concrete and steel that could withstand 16-inch shells and aerial bombs, but they didn't anticipate a fire that breathes. Why? Because they didn't believe it was possible. Their doctrine became a bunker. And here it is, the main lesson. Not military, human. The most deadly vulnerability is certainty in one's own impermeability. History knows many such bunkers. They are made not only of concrete, they are built from ideas that seem eternal, from traditions that cannot be broken, from beliefs that are not questioned, and every time a new, unimaginable fire appears, they turn into tombs for those who hid within them. And now a question for you. What is more terrifying, fire from outside, which you can see and can fight, or the certainty within, which blinds you and makes you dig deeper into your own grave? He who believes in his invincibility always builds the deepest bunker, and always dies in it first. But he who is willing to learn, who doubts, can turn even flame into a weapon. So think about it, and write in the comments just one word that determines the victor in any war, not just on the battlefield, but in your life: fire or faith.